The midday sun beat down on the dust of the small town of Esperanza, turning the air into a furnace. In the center of the town square, where the community's life pulsed, a heavy, humiliating silence reigned. There, on his knees in the dry earth, was Samuel Spencer Sutton, a man whose hands had helped raise every beam of that town and whose face was a map of 70 years of honest labor and unwavering faith. Before him, with boots that gleamed obscenely under the sun, stood Captain Zachary Lawrence, a Mexican army officer whose arrogance was as sharp as his soldiers' bayonets. The reason for this degrading scene was water. Samuel's well, the only one that hadn't dried up during the long drought, had been declared military property. "A useless old man like you doesn't need so much water, Samuel." Lawrence's voice was a whip, cutting through the silence. He kicked the wooden bucket beside the old man, spilling the little water that remained and creating a dark, fleeting stain on the dust. The army is thirsty, and what the army wants, it takes. Samuel didn't reply. His eyes, still clear despite his age, were fixed on the ground. He felt no fear, but a deep pain, a betrayal that went beyond land or water. It was the betrayal of his very honor. He had seen Texas born, bleed, and fight to be free, a place where a man's dignity was his greatest possession. Now, an officer in a borrowed uniform was trampling that very dignity as if it were mud. Around them, the people of Esperanza watched, powerless. Friendly faces who had shared bread and prayers with Samuel for decades now turned away, their eyes filled with shame and fear. Among them, Hannah Delaney, a young woman whose family had practically been raised by Samuel, clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. The tears of anger she held back burned hotter than the sun. A brief flash of memory struck Samuel. Weeks earlier, at the general store, he had heard rumors about Captain Lawrence's cruelty in other villages. A friend had warned him, "That man has no God, Samuel. He feeds on the fear of others." But Samuel, a man who believed in law and decency, had dismissed the warning. "We are all men under the same sky," he had said. "Even a soldier has a code." How foolish he had been. He had believed in the honor of a man who possessed none. Lawrence savored every second of his victory. Humiliating that old Texan, one of the town's founders, was more than just taking a well. It was breaking the backbone of those stubborn people. He wanted them to see their patriarch on his knees so they would understand that resistance was futile. What Captain Lawrence didn't know and couldn't possibly know was that his little play of tyranny had an unexpected spectator. In the dusty saloon bordering the square, the sounds of humiliation seeped through the half-open doors. Inside, seated at a table in the back, a man with broad shoulders and a piercing gaze finished his glass of whiskey. He was not a local. His clothes were those of a traveler worn from the road, and his stillness contrasted with the tension coming from outside. He heard the captain's arrogant voice, saw the bucket being kicked, and felt the weight of the silence from that frightened crowd. He didn't know the old man on his knees, but he recognized the kind of injustice being committed. It was the kind of poison that, if left unchecked, would spread and kill the soul of an entire land. The man's name was Crockett, and he was just passing through. As Captain Lawrence spat on the ground, pleased with his work, the warm Texas wind carried the sound of a chair scraping in the saloon next door. It was a small sound, almost nothing. But in Texas, sometimes the silence of a good man preparing himself is louder than the roar of an army. Samuel Spencer Sutton's humiliation did not end in the square. Captain Lawrence, inebriated by his power, posted 2 permanent guards at the well turning the community's lifeblood into a symbol of his oppression. Water, once shared freely, was now distributed in meager rations, and only to those who showed proper subservience. Samuel, stripped of his land and his public honor, retreated to his small wooden house. The planks he had cut and hammered himself now seemed like a prison. He sat for hours on the porch, looking at the well his father had dug, now guarded by strangers. It wasn't the loss of the water that corroded him from within, but the weight of his neighbors' gazes. They didn't blame him, but the pity in their eyes was a knife twisting slowly in his chest. He, who had always been a pillar of strength, was now an object of compassion. That night, Captain Lawrence and his closest officers took over the saloon, the same one where Crockett had observed everything. They laughed loudly, drank the finest whiskey, and recounted the scene in the square, each telling with more exaggeration. "Did you see how the old man trembled?" Lawrence boasted, slamming his glass on the table. "These Texans talk of courage, but deep down they're all sheep. Just show them your teeth and they cower." He raised his glass, a toast to order and to the ease with which a man's spirit can be broken. His men laughed, echoing his cruelty. What they didn't notice was the quiet man sitting in the darkest corner of the saloon, the same man from the afternoon. Crockett was there, listening to every word, every laugh, every drop of mockery. His face was an impassive mask, but inside a fire was igniting. He didn't just see an old man being humiliated. He saw the reflection of hundreds of faces, the faces of the men who had fought and died at the Alamo. Men who gave their lives for an idea, the idea that no man wearing any uniform had the right to crush another's dignity. Those laughs in the saloon weren't just about an old man in a well. They were an insult to every anonymous grave that marked the land of Texas. Hannah Delaney, unable to bear the inertia, tried to act. She went from door to door, trying to organize the town's men to confront Lawrence. But fear was a poison that had already spread. "And what will we do, Hannah?" said a blacksmith, a strong man who now seemed small. "He has soldiers, rifles. We have pitchforks and hunger. We can't leave Samuel like this," she insisted, her voice choked. "He's one of us, and because we are of him, we must be smart," replied another. "A bowed head survives to fight another day." The door closed in her face. Samuel was alone. The community, paralyzed by fear, had isolated him. Crockett, from the corner of the saloon, watched Lawrence's arrogance grow with every drink. The captain wasn't just cruel, he was careless. He believed in his own invincibility, and that was the crack in his armor. He underestimated the people he oppressed and, more dangerously, he underestimated the legends that land was capable of generating. The captain didn't know it, but every word of mockery was a nail in his own coffin. Because in the dark corner of that saloon, the specter of the Alamo had just awakened, and it had a name: Crockett. Night fell over Esperanza, bringing a cool relief from the day's heat, but not from the tension that suffocated the town. Under the cloak of darkness, Crockett left the saloon. He didn't head for the inn, but walked through the silent streets to the small wooden house on the edge of town, Samuel Spencer Sutton's house. He knocked softly on the door. After a long moment, the doctor opened a crack, revealing the old man's tired face. "What do you want?" Samuel's voice was weak, devoid of its former strength. "Just to talk, if you don't mind," Crockett said, his voice calm and respectful. "I'm a traveler passing through. I saw what happened in the square today." Samuel hesitated, then opened the door. He didn't know who this stranger was, but there was something in his eyes, a quiet firmness that made him trust him. The two men sat in the small room, lit by a single oil lamp. Crockett didn't introduce himself by his famous name. He was just a man, listening to another man's story. Samuel, hesitantly at first, began to speak. He spoke not just about the well, but about his life, about building the town, about the promise he had made to his deceased wife to always care for that community. As he spoke, strength returned to his voice. He wasn't complaining, he was testifying. Crockett listened in silence, absorbing every word. He saw that the humiliation hadn't broken the old man's spirit. It had only wounded him deeply. Later, Crockett found Hannah Delaney near the church. She was praying, or perhaps just seeking refuge in the silence. He approached with the same respect. "You have courage, young lady," he said, trying to rally the men. "Courage doesn't fill buckets of water or restore the honor of a good man," she replied, bitter. "Captain Lawrence, what is his weakness?" Crockett asked, getting straight to the point. Hannah stared at him, surprised. "Weakness? He has a platoon of soldiers." "Every man has a weakness he cannot guard with soldiers," Crockett insisted. "Usually, it's pride." He thought for a moment. "He brags about two things more than anything: his marksmanship with a pistol and his skill at poker. Says he's never been beaten at either." A faint smile touched Crockett's lips. It was exactly what he needed to know. The plan began to form, not with gunpowder and fury, but with cunning. It wouldn't be a battle, but a play, and the stage would be the same square where Samuel had been humiliated. Crockett asked Hannah to do something simple: spread a rumor, a whisper that would pass from mouth to mouth. The story of a legendary hunter from Tennessee, a man who could hit a fly at 50 paces with his old rifle, who was passing through town, curious to see Captain Lawrence's famous marksmanship. The seed was planted. The next day, Lawrence's soldiers began to hear the murmurs. They laughed, of course, but the story was intriguing. The stranger's name wasn't mentioned, which made it even more mysterious. The captain's confidence was a fortress, but even the strongest fortress can be shaken by a persistent whisper. Lawrence's soldiers laughed at the rumors, thinking the people were inventing heroes to console themselves. Little did they know that sometimes legends walk among us, and the greatest of them was cleaning his old rifle, not to kill, but to teach a lesson. The next morning, the sun rose over a different town. The atmosphere of fear had been replaced by an electric current of anticipation. Hannah's whispers had done their work. When Captain Lawrence stepped out of his quarters, he felt the change in the air. The people no longer looked away. They stared at him with an expression he couldn't decipher. It was a mixture of defiance and expectation. It was then that a tall man emerged from the shadows of the general store and walked to the center of the square. It was the stranger from the saloon. He stopped at the exact spot where Samuel had knelt and waited. The captain, angered by the audacity, marched toward him, followed by his soldiers. "Who are you and what do you want in my square?" Lawrence growled. "My name doesn't matter," Crockett replied, his voice resonating clear and calm. "I'm just a friend of Samuel Spencer Sutton, and I've heard you are a man of great skill. I've come to make a wager." "A wager?" Lawrence laughed, a dry, arrogant sound. "What could a drifter like you possibly have to bet? My rifle, my knife, and my horse, everything I own, against the deed to Samuel's well and a public apology to him." The crowd, which had gathered in silence, held its breath. The proposal was so bold, so insane, it paralyzed everyone. Lawrence looked at Crockett, then at the crowd. To refuse would be an act of cowardice. His reputation, his image of absolute control, was at stake. And what would be the challenge, wanderer? "A single shot," Crockett said. pointing to the sky. "We'll toss a coin. Whoever hits it in the air wins." Lawrence smiled. A coin. With his precision revolver against that old heavy rifle? It was a joke. "I accept," he declared loudly for all to hear. "And when I win, I'll hang you for your insolence." The square became an arena. One of Lawrence's soldiers took out a silver coin, its shine cutting through the morning light. The captain went first. He drew his pistol with a fluid, elegant movement. The coin was tossed, spinning in the air. The shot echoed, a sharp crack. The coin fell to the ground with a small nick on its edge, an almost perfect shot. Lawrence smiled, confident. "Your turn, old man," he taunted. Crockett didn't reply. He raised his rifle, an extension of his own body. The rifle he called Old Betsy. He looked at Samuel, who was watching from his house's porch, and gave him a slight nod. "Toss it," he said. The silver coin went up again, a shimmering speck against the infinite blue of the Texas sky. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The world boiled down to that little metal disc, the barrel of the rifle, and the steady gaze of the man holding it. Then, thunder. Crockett's shot wasn't a crack. It was a deep roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the town. The coin simply disappeared. A stunned silence fell over the square. No one saw where it landed. Minutes later, a boy found it near the church. It was split, perfectly divided in two. The arrogance on Lawrence's face dissolved, replaced by a pale disbelief. His soldiers looked at him, no longer with admiration, but with a new disconcerting lack of respect. He hadn't just lost a bet, he had lost his aura of invincibility. Crockett slowly lowered the rifle. He walked up to the captain, who stood frozen. "In Texas, a man is measured by his word," Crockett said, his voice low but carrying the weight of justice. "Now, keep yours." And it was only then that he introduced himself. "My name is Crockett. Davy." "Crockett!" The name fell upon the square like lightning, and what had been admiration in the crowd turned into reverence. When the townspeople saw Captain Lawrence mount his horse, defeated and without honor, no one cursed him. Only silence accompanied him out of town. Justice in Texas sometimes doesn't need shouts. The sound of shame is enough. Captain Lawrence's departure was the beginning of healing for Esperanza. The well was returned to Samuel, who immediately declared that, as it had always been, the water belonged to everyone. People gathered around him, no longer with pity, but with renewed pride. That night, the town celebrated, not with a boisterous party, but with a community dinner in the square. Tables were set and food, once scarce, was shared with joy. Samuel Spencer Sutton sat at the head, not as a humiliated patriarch, but as the living symbol of his people's resilience. He had endured the darkness and, through his silent dignity, had drawn the light. Crockett was the guest of honor, but he carried himself with the humility of an ordinary man. He ate alongside Samuel and Hannah, listening to the town's stories, sharing smiles and handshakes. He refused all offers of reward. "Justice has no price," he said simply. "I was just passing through." At dawn, before most of the town awoke, he mounted his horse. Hannah and Samuel were there to bid him farewell. "Texas owes you a great deal," the old man said, his voice firm. Crockett simply touched the brim of his hat. "Texas owes me nothing. We owe everything to it." And with those words, he rode towards the rising sun, disappearing over the horizon as mysteriously as he had arrived. The story of that day became a legend in Esperanza, told from generation to generation. It wasn't just the story of an impossible shot, but a lesson about the true nature of strength. Strength wasn't in the gleam of a uniform or the number of rifles. but in the courage of an old man who refused to let his soul kneel, and the wisdom of a hero who understood that the most powerful justice is that which restores honor rather than spills blood. Captain Zachary Lawrence was never seen in those lands again. It is said he was discharged from the army, his career ruined by humiliation. He became a forgotten footnote, a man who tried to erase the Texan spirit and ended up being erased by it. Samuel Spencer Sutton lived many more years, a respected and beloved man, whose story inspired courage in countless others. Years later, children would ask old Samuel about the day a ghost from Tennessee saved the town. He would just smile, look at the horizon, and say, "It wasn't a ghost. It was just a man who remembered what Texas means." And that, children, is more powerful than any army. If you were moved by this story of honor and courage and are proud of the roots and values that forged Texas, subscribe to our channel. Share this video with everyone who also feels that pride in their chest. And don't forget to comment from which city or state you're watching. Your story is also part of ours.